Good day, everyone. Welcome to this second of 4 webinars on managing organizational risk in a pandemic, presented by Forrest and Company Limited. My name is Jason Legere, and I'll be moderating today's session. From a logistics standpoint, we will be recording this session, and a recording link will be provided to you all via email at a later date. We have set aside time for questions at the end of the session, so please use the Q&A feature within Zoom to type your questions, and I will read them off to Mark at the end of the session. We will also be conducting polls throughout the session, and please note that both your questions and your poll responses will be collected anonymously. Your presenter today is Marc Tassé. Mark is the Vice President of Risk at Forrest and Company Limited and is an internationally recognized and sought-after expert on anti-bribery, corruption, compliance, and business ethics. He teaches at multiple Canadian universities and has presented to parliamentary committees on areas of money laundering and the proceeds of crime, in addition to maintaining a varied client list. Mark, welcome. We look forward to your comments and insights. Over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jason, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to see that there's some of you that are here today to discuss about compliance management system. As you might have known, a compliance management system is a part of an ISO standard. So it's ISO 37301. So that's the standard that actually covers the compliance management system best practice around the world, like any other type of different ISO standards. But I would say the compliance management system is one that is very relevant for companies because it actually set out the tone and the culture of the company. So it's actually identify if the company want to comply or not.
This brings us to our first poll of the day. Does your organization have a compliance management system? And if so, how often is it reviewed? So if we have a look at the results, we will see that 17% say they do have a compliance management system, but it is not regularly reviewed. 17% says yes, there is a compliance management system, but I'm unaware of how often, if at all, it is reviewed, and 67% have said that no, there is no compliance management system at their organization. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Jason. So from that result, we can see that 2 out of 3 don't actually have a compliance management system. And I hope that by the end of the day, or at the end of the session, you will technically see that there might be an added value in having one. So let's start, first of all, with defining what a compliance management system is. So it is a set of processes to make sure that an organization operates in accordance with all applicable laws, regulation, and codes of conduct. And at this point, I will put your attention to the difference between compliance and ethics. And in the first webinar, I actually spoke about it, but I'm just going to go very quickly to give you an overview of it. So basically, when we're complying to something, we are respecting the letter of the law, while on the other hand, when we're actually showing ethics and codes of conduct, then at this point, we're respecting the spirit of the law. So even though it's called compliance management system, it's not only to comply with the letter of the law. So that's why when they said applicable laws and regulation, and also codes of ethics. And sometimes you will see people that will talk about compliance and ethics. They regroup them together, which is technically very good because you want to make sure that you're not only complying to what you have to, you also go one step above and you show ethics in your way of operating. So as I said, it's called compliance management system, but it also regroups ethics and integrity. So today we'll see which part covers ethics and which part covers the strict application of the law. But one thing that you will also notice with compliance management system is that they are industry agnostic, scalable, adaptable, and also covers all aspects of compliance, not just the legal or regulatory compliance, as I just pointed out. So when we comply we actually go one step above and we look at the ethics. One thing that we're very aware of, and that we be very careful when we design a compliance management system, is that we don't actually have people that will find out the loopholes. Remember last week I was talking about the chief loopholes officers? They're always the one who actually increase our reputational risk because they will find a way to get around it. So in your compliance management system, it's not to find ways to get around regulations or laws. It's really to make sure that people comply with what we're expecting from the company. And this is important. So it's the image of the company, because if you do not have a compliance management system, then automatically there will be a risk for your reputation. And we see more and more companies now that are focusing on trying to mitigate as much as possible the reputational risk. So and especially crisis management expert, they really want to make sure to avoid to have to come up to the public and say, well, you know what, we had not took that into consideration. This is one of the last things you want to do, because then it shows negligence from your part. So you always want to show that you actually had a system in place and they had some procedures and controls, and that if they were not respected, then you'll take a corrective action. But at least there was procedures and guidelines in place and the employees were aware of it. So that's very important. And I'm saying employees, but it would also include your third parties. So anyone that actually do business with the company. Could be your suppliers, could be your agent, it could be some of your representative. They need to comply to the compliance management system. So they need to be, first of all, aware of it and then to comply with it. Okay, so a compliance management system addresses an organization. Two things, as I pointed out, the requirement and also the commitment. And even though it's called compliance management, keep in mind it's not only the requirement, what we must comply with, it also covers what we have committed to. So what we choose to comply with, and that is part of the organization culture. So you want to make sure that when we're talking about compliance, and mostly if you comply to your commitment, the requirement usually is pretty easy because we're aware of it. But the commitment, this is something that we have to be also really aware, because the stakeholders are looking up at the company. And if you do not actually comply to your commitment, this is usually when it ends up on the social media, and you want to avoid that at all costs. So your compliance management system should align with the firm, first of all, risk tolerance, with the firm strategy, with the commitment to the corporate social responsibility, and it should also state your values and ethics. And I'd like to put the emphasis on each of them. So the risk tolerance, what do the executives of the company, it could be the board of directors, it could be the C-level suite, what is their risk tolerance? What are they comfortable with? Then what's the strategy in order to comply? And then what is the commitment to the corporate social responsibility? This is so important because a lot of stakeholders are now looking at what is your CSR action that you're making, and they want to make sure that it's not only on paper. They want to see action to show that you're a good corporate citizen. And finally, companies have values and ethics that they promote. They have code of ethics, the set of values that they promote on their website, on their annual report. Well, it's really, really important that whatever you're promoting, that you're committing to it. Because if you do not commit to it, then you're going to be exposed to some, I would say, bad publicity, which you always want to avoid. So next slide, please, Jason. So basically, the compliance management system reduces the firm's risk by ensuring a robust system. And this word is very important, robust system, to avoid exposure and non-compliance in different areas. So I'm saying robust because too often people are going to turn out to their lawyers and say, do you have a template that I could be using? Well, if they're using a template as a starting point, I'm all good with it. But if they're just taking the template and just changing names or inserting their names into it, then I have an issue with it, because basically this needs to be tailored to the company culture, ethics, values. So you cannot take it from one company to another. I agree that if you have a subsidy, then at this point it may be almost the same, but still you want to adapt it to the company. So because if you don't adapt it, people don't feel the ownership of it. And if they don't feel the ownership, they don't feel that they are accountable for it. But keep in mind that the corporate management system will foster a culture of compliance, ethics, and transparency, and at all level of the company. So that's important to also realize that you need to be transparent. So if something went wrong, you need to actually be fully transparent and disclose it. This is something that sometimes executives have issues with, to say, if we do so, then we're going to expose the company to a media scandal. Well, it's always easier if you're the one exposing it than if you're reacting to it. And that's the thing with the compliance management system. You actually have a system in place, and as soon as you're made aware of a non-compliance, then you need to take corrective action. But remember last week I was talking about the board of directors' responsibility. First one was to prevent. The second one was to detect. The third one was to inform. And the last one was to correct. So you need to inform, you need to be fully transparent. And this is something that people try to forget on some occasion, but please don't. Always remember that if you're fully transparent, then it's always easier to deal with the crisis that you're in than if you're just like delaying or hiring people that are either spin doctors or, and I like that term, spin doctors, because the spin doctor is someone that will take a situation which is pretty bad and make it look pretty good. I'll give you an example of that. Remember Volkswagen when they had the issue a couple of years ago, and they had a little widget that was actually changing the result, let's call it nicely, changing the result of what they were doing in terms of pollution. And the spin doctors that they hired actually turned around and said, you know what, every car maker in the industry is doing it. And since we got caught, we had to remove it. And since we removed it, now the best car you can buy is a Volkswagen, because this car is eco-friendly now, because we don't have that widget anymore. And all the other people, all the other car makers have it also. So you see, that's bad. But that's what a spin doctor does. So we take a bad situation and convert it to something good. Well, when you're in compliance management system, you don't want to need to have to hire a spin doctor. You want to avoid that. You want to show that you're complying, that you're fully aware of what should be done, and that you're doing it. So the legal part. And then you also want to make sure that you see what is the value of the industries. So in the industry that you're in, what are the values? What are the ethics that are acceptable, or even not acceptable, I would say expected from the major players? And as a major player, you need to lead by example. So you need to make sure that what you have in place and what your employees are doing is really respecting everything. And sometimes people ask me, well, Mark, why do we need a compliance management system for that? We just need to monitor our employees. And I always say it's easy when you have a small company of 4 or 5 people. But you have to have a company of about 40,000 people that operate on 50 different, or in 50 different countries. How can you monitor everyone? That's really hard. And sometimes I tell people, I said, do you know what your kids did last night? Now with COVID-19, it's easy, they're stuck at home. But let's say before COVID-19, I was asking them, are you fully aware what your teenagers did? And they said, well, we don't know, but we know that at least they were in this morning. And we told them that there are things they can do, things they cannot do. And I always say, okay, well, you see, it's hard to be able to fully know what your own kids are doing. So imagine within a company. That's always something challenging. And you will see one thing that we talk more and more about compliance management system. The reason why we're saying not only the law and the regulation, you go one step above and talk about ethics, it's mostly because of social media. So you have employees that actually goes on social media and share their views on different issues. Having employees sharing their views on some issues might be good and sometimes might be bad, depending on their views. And the problem for a company is that when the employee goes on social media and shares some of their views, how is it perceived? Is it perceived as they are representative of the company and that the company endorse whatever they're saying? So that's one thing you want to invest in terms of the culture, to say the compliance management system actually lists some guidelines in terms of ethics, what we do, what we don't do, what we're allowed to do. And as an employee, you need to be aware of it. So that's one of the things that we focus on with the compliance management system. So it's not only money, it's not only laws, it actually relate to other type of issues. Recently, we had Black Lives Matters in Canada. Right now in Quebec, we see like a second wave of Me Too movement. So companies had to react to that, and even large companies had to let go some of their executives. We saw that this weekend. Ubisoft decided that there was a toxic culture and that they needed to remove some of their executives. We saw other companies also having to deal with the toxic culture. And whenever we're talking about toxic culture, it can be pretty broad, but you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So that will be part of your compliance management system. Okay, next slide, please, Jason.
So this is the second poll of the seminar where we're asking, who is in charge of your compliance management system? Given that we had several people in the last poll who said that they did not have a compliance management system, allow me to share the results. 14% said that there was a chief compliance officer. 14% said a chief financial officer. 14% said another management role within the organization, and 57% did not know. Mark, back over to you.
Thanks, Jason. So you see, this is interesting. Just to show you, remember I was saying that once you have something, you need to share it with the employees. Right now, 57% of the people said, we know we have one program, but we don't know actually who oversees it. And that's important because it means that there is a program, but people take it for granted. They know it exists if they Google it on their intranet or if they look at different documents, it's there, but it has never been explained to them. They don't know who's in charge of it. So that's one big challenge because too often we kind of take for granted that there is someone who oversees everything while really there might not be anyone, unfortunately. So having the chief compliance officer, usually that's the right person to deal with that. Chief financial officer, yes, for some companies, the chief financial officers usually oversees the internal controls. So because of that, some people will say, okay, well, it relates to a lot of internal control. If you respect the controls that we put in place, then technically you're complying, which I'm not too sure, but still. And then you also have other people. So that's great. So it means sometimes you'll see people from HR that will be managing this system, which would also be good. The important is that the person that actually oversees or manages the compliance management system reports to the top executive. So you get the support from the executive. And whenever we're developing and maintaining this program, it's we want to make sure that we plan, that we do, that we check, and that we adjust. And my focus is mostly on checking and adjusting. So the checking part is the monitoring. So you put things in, first of all, you will identify an exhaustive list of compliance requirement and commitment, but then you will also investigate and analyze the likelihood and severity of non-compliance threat. And then you will decide which element you want to include in the compliance management system. But once you do so, then you implement them. But then you need to monitor it on a frequent basis. You want to make sure that people are complying. It's a compliance management system. So you want to test it. You want to follow up on it. And it's normal that some people will not always comply 100%. It could be because they misunderstood something, because they're not sure. So you always want to make sure that whatever they don't understand, that you explain it to them. And then if it's right that they made a mistake and it's because there wasn't any control to pick it up, well, you want to adjust it. It's either that the control that you have in place is not relevant anymore, or people don't understand it, or people don't believe in it. One of the worst things is to have a compliance management system in which people don't believe in. They don't actually want to comply with it because they think it's only red tape. And too often people will see that as a showstopper, as something out of which they're going to say, oh, well, it's not really important. This is not what should be done. And we always have other type of internal control that are in place and we don't need to do that. Well, that's totally wrong. And if there is a compliance management system, it's to help people. It's to actually prevent things from happening. And especially with COVID-19, it becomes so more relevant and so more useful because everything has changed. So now you want to make sure that people are complying. Just think of people that are working remotely from home right now. Are they protecting the information as they should? Are they complying with the procedures to use personal computer or have access to the internet and not sharing their information, having firewalls, not removing them, not going on social media on their personal or their office laptop or whatsoever. So those are all examples that we might have forgot about. And that's important to always review your compliance management system in order to include them. So next slide, please. So right now, remember at the beginning, I was talking to you about the ISO standard, because this is like a 30-minute presentation. So I cannot go in everything like in deep of all the relevant matters, but things is that there is an ISO standard that is there to help you and that describe different steps that you need to put in place if you do want to have a compliance management system that is robust. So first of all, you define the scope. Then you also define the normative references. So you need to define like terms and definitions. You make it clear. Don't leave it vague, because then people will give their personal interpretation, which is not what you want. Then you also need to take into consideration the context of the organization. It's like, we operate in which industry? What is the trends right now? And especially in terms of ethics, not about the law. The law, it's easy, but it's about how are people perceiving our industry? What do we need to do to be perceived as good corporate citizens? So that's important. Then the leadership, you need to have the support from the top. Very often we used to say tone from the top. Now we go one step further and we say conduct from the top. So you want to make sure that your top executives are complying with the compliance management system, that they're leading by example in terms of ethics. So that's very important. Once you add that, you plan, then you get the support needed in order to be able to implement a compliance management system. And also, in order to operate it, you need to have someone that will have a portion of his time that will be allocated to it. In some companies, depending on the size, you may have someone that it's full job just to do that. And some other smaller companies, someone that is a portion of the job is to oversee the compliance management system. It doesn't really matter how much of their time is dedicated to it. What is important is that people are actually accountable for it. So someone take the lead and say, this is my responsibility. This is what I need to do. So that's very important. And then point number 9, do the performance evaluation, do the monitoring, do some online testing, go ahead and try it. Try to take some samples, try to see, and at this point you can even use artificial intelligence in order to help you, or data analytics, but still make sure that you test it as often as you consider that you need to do it. And finally, make the improvement, change it on a regular basis. don't say we have a compliance management system. It was actually put in place in 2012, and we had a review in 2017, and the next one is planned in 2022. That's not the way it should be. This should be reviewed on an annual basis. You know, when you do your monitoring, depending on the result that you get, then you improve it. So next slide, please. So what is next? It's always asked the question. So what's the next step to do now? So now that you know what a compliance management system is, what is your next step? So first of all, you need to assess your compliance plan through the lens of your risk culture, the legal and regulatory requirements and commitment, and also on your ethics culture. So the corporate ethics culture, what does the company tolerate? Because a culture is always as good as what is not tolerated. So you may have the best ethics plan on paper, but if you tolerate people not to actually comply with it, if you tolerate non-ethical behavior, then all your compliance management system is not useful at all. So make sure that if you consider implementing one or reviewing the one you have or adapting it, make sure that you get the support from the executives. Make sure that this is brought to your board of directors, because they are the one who actually need to oversee that, because that's part of their shareholders response, not shareholders, but board of directors responsibility, in order to make sure that they actually have this risk under control. And you can also benchmark your existing plan if you have one. Benchmark it against the ISO 37301 standard, as I was saying. It's pretty easy. You can compare, and as I always suggest, you do the gap analysis or the stress test if you want to, and you look at what you have in place right now versus what's the best practices are. To say, okay, well, there might be a gap, and the reason is logic, or we are comfortable with it and we can deal with the risks that relates to it. But you want to make sure that whatever comes up, you're going to be ready for it, and that you actually have something that is very useful. Okay, next slide, please. So that brings us to the question and answers. So I see that there was already some questions that have been posted right now. So Jason, if you want to read them, and I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Certainly. The first question is this: if I understand correctly, the compliance management system will help as long as everyone in the organization both knows about it and follows it. Is that correct?
That's totally correct. And as you say, first of all, they're made aware. So what training do they receive? What support do they have? If we just send them a memo out of which we say, okay, please find in the attachment, we have our code of conduct, and we also have our compliance management system program. Well, that's not worth much, or maybe as an intro, but you need to train the people. You need to make sure that you're taking examples that really relate to what they do, so they get the buy-in into it. And also, if the fact, as the last part of the question was, if people don't comply with it, then there need to be some consequences. It's not, okay, well, you're right, maybe next year when we're going to review the program, we're going to change it. No, it should say, no, that's the existing program in place right now. You did not comply to it. We need to have a corrective action immediately. And we also need to make sure that there's no way that you can actually not comply anymore right in the future. Because if people are not complying, it's probably because the control you have in place are not efficient.
Okay, thank you. What is the requirement for me to ensure that my supply chain is compliant? For example, I have a supplier that is not complying with local legislation. What is my exposure?
Well, your exposure is a risk exposure. So if he's not complying with the local requirements, then at this point, if ever there is like an accident or legal consequences, you will be actually hit by that, because people will say, well, you did business with someone that was not respecting the law. So you want to avoid, and then usually what you have to do is to tell your supplier or your third party to say, you know what, there is laws and regulation. You need to comply with them. If you don't, then we're going to have to stop doing business together. It's as easy as that. You have to be firm. I always think of Joe Fresh, the scandal they had Loblaws, because one, their third party was not respecting in terms of safety. And even though it was in Bangladesh, their reputation was tarnished because of it. And there were some legal consequences for them also. So it's always better to inform your third party and tell them that if you do not comply with our compliance management system, unfortunately, we're going to have to we're going to have to terminate our relationship.
Thank you. The next one is, I believe that there are compliance processes in my organization, but there is no one system or accountable executive. What is the benefit of a central accountable executive?
Oh, it's mostly because there's someone that can actually oversee. Otherwise, if you just rely on everyone good faith, well, that could work. But if you're a small corporation, but if you have a medium size to a large company, relying on people good faith and understanding is not enough. And you need to have someone that they can turn to if they have some questions, because it's never 100% clear. There's always the gray zone, the situation out of which you're saying, well, I think I'm making the best ethical decision based on the information that I have right now. But I would like to have someone to validate it, someone to actually coach me or lead me in it. So then if you have someone that is responsible, that person might be able to answer. And if not, then they might turn to legal counsel or external consultant and get the answer, because the employee expects someone to guide them, to oversee what's going on. So you need to have it centralized. Otherwise, it's relying on people good faith, and most of the time it might be great if you're very, very small. But as soon as you have medium size, and even not medium size, but I would say as soon as you get like more than 20, 25 people, it's really hard to see what they're doing all the time and to make sure that they're always complying with the and also because of the fact that there is a lot of laws and regulation that change very rapidly. So you want someone who oversees that and will be able to share it with your employees. The danger very often is that when your employees are there for a very long period of time, they actually remember laws that were there when they started, and then they don't realize that since they started, there have been some changes. I've been talking to the chief compliance officer of Bombardier, and it was really funny because she was telling me that whenever she goes to Bombardier, Germany, she goes there and she talks about the rules and regulation, and they say, okay, that applied to Bombardier Canada, but here in Bombardier Germany, it's different. And she said, no, we're all the same. So that was the big issue that she had, to make them realize that we have to comply to every laws around the world. It's not only your local laws and regulation. You have to comply to a whole set of laws and regulations.
Thank you. How do you balance a robust compliance management system with kind of a big brother over the shoulder type of micromanagement?
Okay, well, it's really, you need to tell people that there's a compliance management system which includes some controls that are already in place in order to validate, to make sure that the program is working well. But you're telling them that you're always respecting their privacy, that you will not install cameras to watch and see if they're complying. You're not going to tape their line. You're not going to be monitoring what they do on their laptop, watching every email. So you have to tell them that they're entitled to their privacy. But on the other hand, whenever they're exposing the company in terms of reputational risk, then you will investigate and you will take corrective action. So it means you cannot tell your employees when you go home at night, you're not allowed to go on the social media and give your opinion on some issues. But if you go on the social media and you post some very offending comments, well, it may actually backslash on the company reputation. So then you're going to tell them, say, we were made aware that you posted something on the social media. We investigate, and the result of our investigation is that what you did is inappropriate, and there need to be some corrective action and also some consequences. But so you're not there to, you see, the controls you put in place are there to prevent. The detection part is something different, but you need to tell them to say, the reason why we need to have a compliance management system is it's really because we're not Big Brother. Because if we were Big Brother, we didn't need to have that system. We would already monitor everything you do. So we would not have to put a system in place to make sure that you do what you're supposed to. So if we put a compliance management system in place, it's because you have freedom, you have a latitude out of which you can operate, and we trust you. But we need to validate to make sure that whatever you're doing is within the guidelines.
Okay. For those issues that do end up in court, does the Crown take into account the robustness of the compliance management system when considering judgment or penalties?
Yes, they do, as long as it was robust and you actually had procedures in place in order to prevent something from happening. So it's not because your compliance management system you're telling employees you should always comply to all laws and regulations. You share with them who sees your program that was qualified enough to do so, and you had someone that was have enough resource to do so. So that's something important also. So it will help you in court if you're able to show that you had a robust program, that it was really well funded, and that there were procedures and action that were taken. But on the other hand, if you don't, then it's not really relevant. But on the other hand, another issue is important also is that if something happened and you want to file an insurance claim, well, if you don't have a compliance management system that is robust, well, when you're going to file your insurance claim, you might not be able to get what you're expecting, because they're going to say that there was a negligence from your part and that they're not covering negligence. This is something that is also important to realize, that negligence is never covered by any type of insurance policy that you might have.
Thank you. What does a stress test look like? Can that be done internally?
Yes, it can. It can, but sometimes people will get the help from external consultant or advisors to make sure that it is independently done. If you do it internally, well, the stress test will be great, but sometimes people will say, well, you know what, you might want to cover up the fact that we have some issues internally, and the stress test is not really independent. So this is why most companies will do some stress tests internally, but then go externally to have someone independent. It could be a consultant. It doesn't need to be an auditor or an accountant or a lawyer. It could just be an external person that specializes in risk management that will come in, and they will do the stress test and give you an independent opinion. Because keep in mind that this opinion will be given to the board of directors. So they want to make sure that the people who are doing the stress tests are really independent and that they're not feeling any pressure to show results that would make the management look good. Because that's usually the issue. And this is why you see more and more companies, when they use internal audit function, they're outsourcing it to people. And at one point, it might sound strange to say my internal audit is being done by someone externally. Why do we call it internal? It's because they do the work of the internal audit, but it's done by someone externally who doesn't feel the pressure to show everything they have in the company is great. So it shows that board members sometimes have a lack of confidence in the information that is provided to them. So this is why they're always seeking for external independent opinion.
Okay, thank you. And our last question is, are there any emerging best practices around compliance management systems during the pandemic? An example would be a chief compliance officer that may have more direct access to employees.
I would say yes and no. Yes, there's some companies that are actually been very, really good in informing their employees of what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. Think of the government, especially Revenue Canada and the RCMP. Those are two organizations that have been very proactive, mostly because of the nature of the information, which is very delicate information. So, and very sensitive also. So what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and how to protect the information. So CRA and also, as I was pointing out, the RCMP, are leading by example, but some other companies are just putting the cyber risk aside. And at this point, one of the things that in your compliance management system, you want to make sure that people have a protected internet access, that they comply with everything, that their laptop is protected, they're not sharing the laptop with family members and stuff like that. And that's important because you may have some hackers that actually hack into the system and will ask for some ransomware. And if there were companies that are now victim of cyber attack, do you think they're going to be disclosing it? Probably not, because they have no other solution than having people right now working remotely. So companies that might be facing IT issues are not really inclined to disclose it. So in your compliance management system, you need to adapt it to put more emphasis on the internet access and internet management of the work function. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Marc. And that is the end of the question. So before I go into the closing logistics, I would just ask if you have any closing comments.
Sure. So, well, I want to thank everyone that are listening to it and the other people that will receive it by email. Keep in mind that the compliance management system is sometimes seen as something that is, say, just a cost center. And with pandemics, we should reduce staff, and we should also reduce the investment that we're making in our compliance management system. Just keep it as is, and whenever we have more money to review it. I would say that's one that you're looking into what should be done. Make sure that you're aware of what best practices are, and that you get enough money, that because that's an area, the cost of non-compliance is really hard to estimate. Or caught in scandals, they will tell you the non-compliance costs weighted against the profit that you're making from doing something illegal. So that's about my closing statement. But keep in mind that if you want to further discuss on it, if there is, it's only 45 minutes. So in 45 minutes, you cannot totally gather all the information. But if you want to discuss more in detail, or you want to help us compare, we can do the stress test or the gap analysis, we'll be more than happy to.
As Marc was saying, if you'd like to continue the discussion, feel free to reach out to us at any point at info@forrestandco.com, and you can also access us via our website at www.forrestandco.com. As I mentioned earlier, a link to this recording will be shared via email, and we will also include a link to the recording from last week's webinar on an intro to risk management. And we invite you to join us for the 2 remaining sessions, which are happening this month. Next week will be on anti-bribery management systems. And at the end of the month, we will be covering whistleblower management systems. So thank you all for your attendance, and thank you to you, Marc, for sharing your expertise and insights. Thank you all again. Have a pleasant day, and take care, everyone.